say thank you very much to the panel, because I thought that was a really great session, and thanks for taking some time beforehand to prepare with me. I guess I sort of thought it was a good sort of introduction for the Deputy Prime Minister, who was talking about data and what are we doing for whom and where. And you know, the one theme around all of those presentations was around data and understanding population and policy implications for Australia and New Zealand. In particular, is to understand migration and immigration policy and the market and the levers that government can particularly push. And we also heard some very clever words around smart decline and you know, the fifth sort of pillar. So I would like to open it up for questions, but also if people had any comments on that, because there was quite a bit in there and a lot of food for thought, and some of it quite provocative, you know, in particular as an Aboriginal woman and being very focused around the divide and needing to understand different populations. So my mob is a young mob of people. We are a growing mob, and probably the same as Māori and Pacifica communities. So if people so opening up for questions, but also for comments, particularly about, you know, is government doing the right sort of things at the right sort of the time and the right sort of levers. So over to you. Oh, come on.
Hold them up, give them the first one.
All right, well, I'll give you the first one. So I guess I wanted to sort of talk about that issue that you've all sort of touched on, because also the different of people's perceptions. So it's understanding the data, but then people's perceptions under that, and the difference in, you know, between the haves and the have-nots in population divide. In New South Wales, the budget's been handed down, and they do an intergenerational report which forecasts 40 years. So what will New South Wales look like in 2056? And our economy will grow by 2.5 times in real terms, but there will also be a divide in the generation of income and who shares that. So I guess I'm interested not only from the perceptions and the surveys that you've done, and also the work that you've thought very deeply about in terms of how that might play out in Australia and New Zealand.
I flagged it in the presentation. One of the big challenges, I think, and you see it in real time because of the quality of the bulk of the intake. Not everybody shares this story, but if the predominant migrant today, if the majority of migrants today are landing roughly in the middle or the very top of the social structure, you have very, very simple question to ask about how does the rest of the population keep up. Now, sadly, the Indigenous disadvantage story, which is almost impossible for governments to get their heads around, and you've just seen the sort of chopping and changing even on the Northern Territory issue, where you see something on TV, the thing that's in the back of the public mind suddenly becomes front of mind, which is that essentially 2% of the population is not sharing the story of the last 25 years or even the story of 220 something years. And so governments go, okay, another Royal Commission, hang on a minute, we didn't think that through, 2 commissioners, not 1. 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now, ask yourselves a couple of questions. Your tertiary sector in education is on a big revenue driven model via overseas students. Your schools, especially as the kids of the skilled intake come into the system, your schools are starting to crowd out local born kids, simply because there aren't enough schools. You know, and I think the story essentially for most people who can default to the private system at great expense, expense to the household budget, is that they assume there'll be a place for their kid there if their kid doesn't get a selective school, or or you don't have a good public school in your area. Think about what's going to happen in the next few years where there's scarcity, where Australians previously assumed almost universal access. And this is the local-born population, not the Indigenous population, it's the local-born population I'm talking about. If you start to get to a situation in Australia where you have Indigenous plus local-born disadvantage, and it's driven primarily because we're on a default setting because the migration program is keeping the macro data ticking over, then take the anecdote of Victoria public transport system and then take it across the education system. you can't catch this thing up if you let it go. Literally can't catch it up. Because then you've got the political cycle taking over, where you start to get a lot of knee-jerk responses that say, cut the program. So that'll be my first thought. But I'm interested in what the New Zealand perspective is and how anyone has been thinking about these things in New Zealand.
Well, there's New Zealanders in the room who would be as competent as I am to answer it. But the New Zealand situation is the same, but there's a few complicating factors. So we do the same polling as Andrew has been doing, and this is for the Asian New Zealand Foundation, and the responses have been trending upwards, except for the Māori respondents, and they're trending down. So there's a political, cultural dimension in which they see some of the exclusion from the education market or the labour market as being an issue, but they're also deeply concerned that the diversification of New Zealand's demographic base is then going to change the balance. And I don't know whether you noticed, but that already the Asian communities of Auckland are larger than the combined Māori and Pasifika communities of Auckland. And then sometime, again, because the population change is occurring so fast, we would have said mid-20s, it looks like it's going to be early 20s, when the population, the Asian population of New Zealand will hit 800,000, which will make it the same size as the Māori population. So suddenly the political landscape changes quite a bit. But the other side is that many of the Māori iwi tribes are getting settlements. So I work with Ngāti Kahungunu in Hawke's Bay. Over the next 3 years, I beg your pardon, they will receive a settlement of $500 million. That's an injection into the local economy. They are going to look at new schemes of economic but also social and educational development. What is that going to look like? We're not sure, but they're becoming major players in their own right. And quite how that sits along the issues that we've been talking about, I'm not sure, because it's new territory. So it's same in New Zealand, but I think there are some additional dimensions given the power of Māori communities or Māori organisations. And I'll just end with something which is which I've made before, which is not a popular point. There's a lot of economic power that resides in Māori organisations. Māori households are a very different matter.
Yep, I think that's a good point. Did you have any perspective, Andrew?
Just a couple of points. Like George, you're saying we're going to have this problem going forward. I think we've got the problem now. We
already have it. But
the school problem has been there for 20 years.
We're in a position where we can respond as policymakers. I think we're almost reaching that closing window.
Yep. And with regard to the trajectory of the Indigenous population, there's a different trajectory, I think, in New Zealand and Australia. Australia, it's still, responding to crisis. New Zealand is sort of settlement and moving forward. And I conducted some focus groups with Indigenous Australians, and they were saying, got nothing against immigration, but what about us? We're getting left behind. If you want to put in a new housing estate, well, our housing gets ripped up and we get further moved out, and you're putting the immigrants there. We're at the bottom of the colour spectrum. That sort of attitude is what I was hearing.
Yep. And George, in one of the firm things that he sort of started off with and ended with was that sort of fifth element, and government has different levers to pull, and one of them is around should government be more active in that policy mechanism and understanding the market and driving that market a bit differently. And in your results about perceptions, you had some, and probably cut you off, about the different visa categories, and in particular I was interested in exploring that and your feelings around how government should be more involved and some of the unintended consequences of the way that visas have been defined or restricted, and particularly the comment you made around second-class citizens with that category. So do you mind just exploring that a little bit more, please?
Yep. So say with the business visas and the skilled visas, probably the preferred option would be get everyone on 457s. But you don't fill up the 457s relative to employer demand. So you have quite a large category of independent skill. And then the independent skill are on their own, basically. They're attracted to Australia because, as you explained, the middle class, exactly the same comment, like, it takes me 3 hours to get to work in Mumbai. I come here for quality of life. It's not that I desperately need a job. I'm coming for quality of life. And what's happening here is that I just actually can't get my foot in the door because I've come as an independent skill. I think people know that there's huge problems with the way that job applications are filtered. You apply online, you know, if your name is Mohammed, forget it. If you change your name to Michael, you get callbacks almost immediately. So this was a really, really strong aspect of the way that the labour market is handling these issues of recruitment.
Yeah.
You know, with regard to the New Zealanders, yes, the message
I could
was
hear people bristling in their seats when you said that.
that by coming to Australia, we're actually improving our financial circumstances. And people would say, you know, I was doing this job in Auckland getting $15 and now I'm doing this and I'm getting that. So in that sense, it's good, and for a whole range of reasons, it's very positive. But then there's this very strong feeling of discrimination. And people will say, often we're living side by side because they're often maybe living in Liverpool rather than central Sydney.
Right.
We're living side by side with asylum seekers, or same in Logan. And we see the level of assistance that they're getting from government, and for us it's very constrained. And in particular, in terms of pipeline effects, this issue about, and I'll finish very quickly, this issue about not getting HECS if you're a young student because you're not qualified, and in theory you can go back to New Zealand, you can do a whole range of things, but they're not good options. And again, the pipeline effect of getting your most talented young people in the high schools at year 10 saying, well, there's no future for me, going down that tertiary education path, what am I going to do?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's
Can I just, interesting point, because I know we've got a lot of New Zealanders in the room. When you look at, and you do understand it by doubling the Auckland story, which is the Melbourne and Sydney story.
Yep.
Not only do you double the size of the cities, you've got two of them doing the same thing, which is running a very cosmopolitan but Asia-centred migration program. So the Chinese-born are already the #1 immigrant group in Sydney. And on present trends, the Indians will be 1, the Chinese 2, and the Brits 3 in Melbourne in the next decade or so. When you go out to Perth, the English-born are actually the largest group, and you don't have the same Chinese and Indian sort of proportions in Perth. You've got you're oversubscribed for South Africans as well. The Kiwis are the #1 immigrant group in Brisbane. So conceptually, it's all very fascinating when you think about demography, but whether you were a higher or low immigrant centre in Australia up until the turn of the 21st century, the rankings were roughly the same. You know, Brits 1, Italians 2 after the Second World War, and then later Brits 1, Kiwis 2 from the 70s onwards. Now Australia is actually going in 3 different directions. Melbourne, Sydney, Eurasian. Brisbane, and essentially the southeast corner of Queensland, is sourcing a Pacific identity. And over in the west, and even in South Australia and in Adelaide, the mother country for some reason. You hop over the Indian Ocean, you end up back in the 19th century. So that Australia is actually going to be very, very difficult for politics to hold together, let alone the public policy challenges. The identity question becomes central. What is it to be in Australia? And I can tell you as a Melburnian, what is it to be an Australian? You're living in the capital city of open Australia. But there's a lot of other places, even in the suburbs of Melbourne, we know in the northern suburbs of Melbourne, but when you get to the rest of Australia, it is incomprehensible what's going on in Melbourne and in large pockets of Sydney.
Absolutely. Did you have a comment?
No. Next question.
Does anybody have a question or comment? Surely we've provoked. Thank you very much for being the first question.
Yeah, I'll take a crack. So my name's Greg Johannes, I'm from the Tasmanian Public Service. So I'm just reflecting on the title there and the fact that in a lot of public service legislation and regulations around the country, certainly in mine, there's a reference to the fact that my public service should be drawn from and reflect the community it serves.
Yeah.
But in reality, my public service bears little relation to the demographic profile that's just been painted, whether it's along cultural lines or age lines. And I think it bears little relation to the attitudinal profile that we heard about, what the person in the street says about government and migration and the like. So I'm just interested in the panel's view. Should I care about that? Is that an issue for good public policy making, the fact that public services, or at least mine, I won't speak on behalf of anyone else's, doesn't reflect the demographic makeup of the community that theoretically it's drawn from and serves?
Well, that is not only that is not only the first question, it's a very good question. So who would like to start?
Let me. Exactly the same on the other side of the Tasman. And what we're commissioned by the government. We got $5 million last year to look at what's called the diversity dividend. And when we take that into organisations, and here we talk private sector but also public sector, what does that look like and what are the benefits and what should organisations be doing? So we're starting to put together a little bit of a package, which is what do you actually, firstly, do you record the identity of your staff? I'm really staggered that how little data was collected on that. But then what then happens? What does your leadership look like? How do you relate to clients or customers or whatever else you want to do? How do you roll with the organisational shift that needs to take place to reflect the communities that you serve, in this case in the public service? And I think there's a big lag, so that when I don't know whether Andrew was here last year or the year before, but when I went and talked to the chief executives of government departments, they look like me. And when I look around the public service, there are some fantastic new interns and recruits, but it's very, very hierarchical and structured. And so I think that's going to be one of the challenges. And if I can just finish on one point, when we first started doing some of this research, we failed abysmally. We were contracted by the government to look at the settlement and integration of immigrants, and we got back. And what we realised was that the immigrant communities did not trust us. They couldn't talk to us because we didn't speak the same English in some instances. You know, it was different English, and that we didn't act and interact appropriately. And so we then had to subcontract whole teams that could speak Mandarin, that were known to the communities, were trusted by the communities. And so we did a very interesting piece of work last year on whether immigrant business owners were tax compliant. Well, we ended up by saying, why put immigrant in there? Are tax owners, tax compliant? Business owners tax compliant? But really getting good quality information from communities, in this case, if you look at the Auckland environment, the immigrant business owners are a significant part of the economy of Auckland these days. But getting good quality data from those communities required people from those communities.
Andrew,
It wasn't me.
Again, just drawing on the focus groups again, this was a huge issue.
Yep.
It's the issue of communication. Liaison officers in school, just try to example, you try to deal with truancy. Do you know the family? Do you know the community that people come from? If you do, you pick up the phone, you've got a liaison officer from that community and can immediately communicate and deal with those issues. That's just a low-level example. But multicultural workforce is the way to go forward.
Interestingly enough, a number of organisations are asking themselves the same questions now as the population is moving as fast as it is. I'll give you a little insight into session I was involved in with the AFL. And there's a chap called Ali Fahur who is the diversity boffin at the AFL. And he asked everybody in the room to move into three distinct portions of the room. Those who are born overseas to one corner, those who have at least one parent, so second generation in the other corner, and then in the middle would be third generation and above. And he'd have the slide ready to show them what the country looked like versus what they looked like. 90% of the room went to the middle. And this is even before you ask the gender question. You know, a bit over half the population is female, and there's a significant advantage in the female population for tertiary degrees over the guys. So when you tell them that, you're almost telling everybody in the room that some of you are not here on merit, sadly. Not this room, but that room, because why I'm using the AFL as
People are going to get a complex after this.
That's why I'm using the AFL as the example. But then the funny thing is, they sort of didn't get that, but what they did get, I mean, they understood what people were saying to them, but the protective response was, well, you can't ask me to leave this job. What they did understand is once the discussion went into if your front office doesn't look like the community at large, you're almost guaranteeing your organisation, this we're talking commercial, cultural organisation, sporting organisation, is going to lose market share. Yep. And that's actually almost the simplest, because we're in a very, very neoliberal age now and everybody wants to be able to break it down to a market incentive. If you don't look like the country at large, you can guarantee you're not going to be doing your job well. You're not going to be growing.
And I was going to say, from a New South Wales government perspective, it's absolutely an issue. We are not a diverse public service. But interestingly, premiers can choose how many priorities that they want, but our premiers chose two around gender. So one is 50-50, we've got to get to 50-50, and the other one is doubling the number of people like me in Aboriginal senior executive service. And I also wanted to reflect that I know in Victoria that they're running a trial at the moment of looking at blind applications, and that's been done, as you said before, and Mark gets up and Mohammed doesn't, and we'd be looking with interest at that. It is a productivity issue. It is about serving the citizens better, and I think it's incumbent upon all of us as senior executives to think about where is our talent pipeline. If we know from the presentation today that there's very talented people from countries such as China and India coming, how do we reach out and not only just get people into the role, but I'm talking about being more inclusive, so not just the stats, but including in interesting projects, leading interesting work and doing interesting things. Now you have asked to have the last say, and so over to you, because you're between morning smoko. So.
Okay, and I'm a New Zealander.
Excellent.
Two things. I think we're not anticipating the future. We met with the Federal Minister from Germany last year in Mexico City, of all places, and she explained to us why 1 million Syrian refugees, population supplementation, workers. I think countries like ours, particularly countries that are much more advanced in the ageing process like Japan and Germany, are going to look at the systems that we've got for selecting and recruiting skilled migrants. This is a space that we've occupied for a long time. Don't expect it to continue. There's going to be a lot of international competition. But look at our source countries. If you look at Shanghai, if 2.1 births per woman is replacement fertility, the birth rate in Shanghai is at 0.7. It is not even at half. And if you look at what the Chinese government have done recently about tourism, which is to divert outward-bound tourists to inbound tourists, I think if you look at the demography of China, they're not going to allow their skilled middle-class people to continue to come to Sydney, Melbourne or Auckland in the next few years. That will be closed off, and I think it'll be closed off soon and rapidly. So I think we're in a particular phase, and we've been talking about demographic trends, but have a good look out there in the big wide world, because I think we're going to have some new challenges quite soon.
Thank you very much, and thanks for your attention. And I wanted to thank the panel, Andrew, Paul and George, for being with us this morning, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.